Greetings and welcome back to Give the People What They Want. I'm Zoe Alexandra, the editor of People's Dispatch, and as always, I'm joined by my amazing co-hosts, Roger McKenzie, the international editor of Morning Star News, and Prasanth, an Indian journalist. We have a lot of news to get to today, and in fact, as we speak, there's pretty important developments happening. So we're going to try to get to all of that and more and give you, exactly the analysis you need to understand what's happening.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup.
So, Roger, I wanted you to start with the story that we've been coming back to, of course, for the last several years and the last couple of years as it's intensified. Sudan is a war that continues. It's been called one of the worst humanitarian crises in the recent history. Tell us what's happening in Sudan. Is there hope of peace?
Not much on the horizon, unfortunately. What seems to be happening is that the eyes of the world are elsewhere. As always with Africa, it comes right the way down the agenda. It doesn't get the attention that it deserves. But as you say, Zoe, we're faced with one of the biggest humanitarian crises in the world, actually, for some considerable time. Just this week, we had there's been all sorts of accusations about kind of crimes against humanity against both sides in the conflict, actually. This week, we saw allegations against the Rapid Support Forces that they'd killed 300 villagers, just murdered them. This is the sort of thing that comes up every now and then. And as you say, the problem here is there seems to be no end in sight, and there doesn't seem to be any momentum at all to even try and bring a conclusion to this. And I think that's part of the problem that we're faced with. Last week, we saw the International Criminal Court give a report to the UN Security Council saying that they had credible evidence of crimes against humanity and war crimes being committed in Sudan, but still nothing is being done to try and bring this thing to a conclusion. I think part of the problem that we have here as well is that we could easily just concentrate on the fact that there's fighting going on and forget about the fact of that this all actually started with a betrayal of a people's democracy. And that's what we need to be going back to start talking about the need to end this carnage that's taking place in Sudan, which seems to be degenerating into spheres of influence that either the military has over the central zone and the northern zone, I think, and the western zone seemingly controlled mainly by the RSF. And it's in that western zone, of course, that over the years and years ago we saw genocide taking place in that area as well. So we need to be talking about the need to see an end to the fighting, but also a return to a people's democracy that many people struggle for, many people put their lives on the line for, and put their trust in people to deliver. And that was taken over by the military, because in fact these two outfits that are fighting each other now were once in control. They were in cahoots and in control of Sudan. They betrayed the people, and now they're fighting each other over control of the country. So we're in a parlous situation, really, with hundreds of thousands of people displaced. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people, with countless people who have been killed. We'll not know the full number until the fighting stops, I dare say. But this is an awful situation that's facing the people of Sudan. And one of the points you made earlier, Zoe, about we've been returning to this since the conflict started April the 15th, 2 years ago. The problem is many other news networks are not returning to this. So if people want to find out what is going on, then one of the places you can do that is by coming to People's Dispatch, by coming to the Morning Star, by listening to what Prasanth has to say about these things, and just listening to independent media, because the mainstream media seems to be ignoring the massive humanitarian crisis that's facing the people in Sudan.
It's definitely a story that, of course, we will continue to come back to. And I think exactly what you're saying, Roger, is really important to underline, that the base of this, the root of this is with regards to a struggle for democracy, for people's democracy. So that always has to be at the forefront. Speaking of democracy, Prasanth, Pakistan has had there's been reports released about the situation of democracy, human rights in the country. What's the latest there?
Right, Zoe, I mean, the entry point is really a couple of stories that have come on People's Dispatch over the past couple of weeks. We've had stories about the problems journalists are facing in Pakistan, and the most recent, one of the more recent instances was the fact that 27 YouTube channels were shut down, or the order was passed to shut down 27 YouTube channels in the country. A lot of them belonging to the opposition, some of them belonging to independent journalists, who are among the few shining light on what is happening right now. And all of these are taking place under the auspices of what is called the PECA, and that's another media regulation. And it's actually a very worrying trend across the world, but especially in countries like in Pakistan, which have a very strong military dictatorship, or not dictatorship per se, but a very strong military presence and military hegemony, where the concept of fake news is often weaponized by the establishment to target independent voices. I mean, in the name of fighting fake news, in the name of combating misinformation or disinformation, governments pass these very stringent laws, which end up basically being used very conveniently to attack independent voices, to attack opposition voices. And that's what's happening in Pakistan right now. We've seen international press organizations, we've seen Pakistan press organizations, human rights organizations, all opposing this law, but to no avail. But this itself is actually part of the larger crisis of democracy that we have been talking about with regard to many countries on this show. And Pakistan is a very good example of it, a crisis stretching decades, in fact. The most recent iteration of which is the kind of control the Pakistani military under Asim Munir, who is now, for all ends and purposes, declared himself Field Marshal, has over the country right now. There is technically prime minister, president, the prime minister. There's technically all the forms of parliamentary governance in place, but everyone knows that the true authority in the country is Asim Munir and the Pakistani military, and that the civilian government has very little say. Last year, Pakistan had elections in which clearly the most popular force, which is the PTI party, led by Imran Khan, was suppressed, was basically de-recognized. For its candidates were forced to contest his independence. It was, delegitimized in every way possible. And Imran Khan himself is in jail. And a key factor seems to be the fact that he, dared to oppose the foreign policy orders or instructions to the United States, and maybe took some steps, very minimal steps, to maybe carve out a slightly separate path. And that seems to have cost him every aspect of, both his personal freedom and the political freedom of his party. And so Imran Khan remains in jail right now. There have been a lot of demands. Apparently, even Trump has been demanding, because certain sections in the US establishment are somehow trying, for whatever reasons, to do so. But there's been no forward momentum on that. He remains in jail, facing all kinds of very, very random cases. And there's been a very drastic collapse in terms of civil society freedoms, in terms of journalistic freedoms, and all this undergirded by a kind of economic crisis that has been going on for many years. Pakistan, like so many other countries in the world, surviving from one IMF loan to the next, heavily in debt. And in the midst of all of this, you have a completely unrepresentative government comprising two parties, which for decades have been actually against each other, but are now bound to each other, or have been welded to each other by the military, I suppose, and the desire to stay in power. So there's this all-round crisis that Pakistan is facing right now: economic, social, political, and the journalistic crisis that we're talking about is just a symptom in some ways of the kind of larger crisis that's facing. But very important to keep an eye out for these kind of laws, because, like I said, they're being adopted in many parts of the world. the good idea that fake news and misinformation has to be combated now being the latest excuse to target any kind of independent voices, and especially at a time when often a lot of traditional media has been either completely bought over by big corporations, or they have been completely. We've seen this in many parts of the world. Actually, they've been either bought over by big corporations and served purely as an ideological function of big capital itself. And in such places, independent media are the only forces shining some light on what's happening, and now these kind of laws are being used to target them. So very important to track what is happening and also follow those organizations which are tracking these changes.
And Prasanth, I'd add importantly that actually during the military escalation between Pakistan and India, that was another pretext to actually crack down on press freedom. We know that in India, there were, again, dozens of YouTube channels that were banned, media that was actually silenced. So, they use all of these kind of pretexts to actually curb civil liberties and rights. And so, as you say, it's really important to follow this, because the next thing we know, actually, all of these rights are going to be impacted for the whole population. But in that light, just wanted to bring it back to Latin America, where in the past couple of weeks, we've seen the Trump administration escalate attacks in a way that maybe wasn't expected. So, of course, we know that Cuba and Venezuela have been further sanctioned, engaged in these kind of diplomatic rows, of course, with Venezuela, the deportation of over 200 citizens, El Salvador. But countries that have kind of towed, in a way, the middle line, not taking such drastic actions against the United States, for example, not taking action against the military base in their country. And I'm talking about Colombia and Brazil, two countries, again, that aren't super challenging U.S. capital, U.S. military in a huge way. These are progressive leaders that have spoken out about genocide, that have spoken out about U.S. influence in the region, but again, haven't taken, drastic material steps to really reverse the role of the U.S. in the region. Especially, I think the military base is a huge thing, because in both of these countries, in Colombia, there's 7 military bases of the United States. In Brazil, there are several others. So, the U.S. still has its power in these countries, but both have faced kind of increasing attacks from the Trump administration. And I think one, which is quite interesting, is the U.S. attack on Brazil, because, Brazil, again, it's really been towing this line. It didn't recognize, for example, the victory of Maduro when there was a lot of pressure, on both sides. And recently, basically, the Trump administration, perhaps as an expression of its own personal allegiance to Jair Bolsonaro, basically announced that the Lula government was persecuting Jair Bolsonaro, had released several statements regarding this, and then last week released a statement or sent a letter to Lula saying that because of the persecution of Jair Bolsonaro, and I'll just remind people that Jair Bolsonaro was the president of Brazil, and during his term, there were, I think, over 200 cases brought against him. But the big one, which is currently in the Supreme Court, is regarding his involvement in the coup plot against the Lula government and an attempt to overturn the electoral results, saying that the electronic system was faulty. We covered this very extensively at People's Dispatch, so people can go back and look at kind of the insane things that were happening at that time in 2022, 2023. And so Trump, someone who, had experienced perhaps a similar political moment where he said that the elections were fraudulent in 2020. In 2021, the invasion of the Capitol happens. A lot of his supporters storm the Capitol. Similar thing happens in Brazil, 2023. Thousands of Bolsonaro supporters invaded the different seats of power in Brasilia. And now Trump is saying, you're persecuting Bolsonaro. He did not have all of these things are fraudulent. And because of that, I'm going to put 50% tariffs on all Brazilian goods. And so this has really set off this kind of moment in Brazil where Lula's responding. He's saying we prefer dialogue, but we will, we will take the measures necessary to protect our economy, to protect our people. This week, he passed a decree, or he signed a decree saying that they would evaluate the law of reciprocity with regards to tariffs and economic agreements. And so actually Brazil is taking this seriously. There was a mobilization, as you see on the screen, last week thousands of people out in the streets of Sao Paulo in one part, to protest the fact that the Congress vetoed the law to increase taxes on the rich, but also to protest the kind of meddling and imperialist attitude of the United States, of Donald Trump, with these pronouncements. So it's a pretty interesting moment. We're seeing that the masses are supporting Lula. There's a favorable reading of his position in the international sphere and how he's relating internationally. So Trump wanted to kind of undermine him, to upset him, to sow kind of destabilization in the country, but we're seeing that that's actually not having the effect that he desired. So interesting moment. Again, follow People's Dispatch, follow Morningstar for more in-depth analysis of this. We're following it on a daily basis, so you can get more information there. Now we're going to turn it over back to Prasanth. The UN goals, have we met them? What's the status with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting debate. These are called the UN Sustainable Development Goals. They're very, very bureaucraties in some senses, but interesting to talk about them once in a while because they kind of, I think, show us a lot about the world we're living in. Now, these goals were basically agreed upon in 2015, and the idea was that we're supposed to reach these goals by 2030. Very unobjectionable goals like end hunger, end poverty, improve literacy, energy, good access to energy for all, peace, justice, and good institutions, etc., etc. There are 17 such goals, and there are a lot of sub goals in each of these goals. Now, what has happened is that a couple of days ago, the United Nations released a report which basically talked about where we are at these goals, because we're just 5 years left for 2030, and the results are pretty sad, so to speak. Apparently, we are going to meet these goals. When you're talking about these goals, basically we mean the subcategories. So only 35% of these targets are we're either meeting them or are on track to meet them, right? So 65% is either somewhere in the middle, or we're moving too slowly. And in 18% of those targets, we're apparently regressing from the situation we were in 2015. And it's a short report. I urge you to actually quickly go through it, because at the bottom of the report, you'll actually see some of those categories in which we are regressing. For instance, we are doing pretty badly on stuff like housing and basic services. We are regressing on undernourishment and food security. We are regressing on investment in agriculture, quality teachers, for example. All of these are areas we are regressing on. But I think it's also important to sometimes talk about these kind of goals, because one, I think it talks a lot about the kind of framing we're in, right? So, and also reveals a lot about the inequalities. These are, of course, numbers, but what is the story behind these numbers? I mean, the story behind these numbers is the fact that even in the goals where improvements have been made, there is a lot of unevenness, and it's usually the global south, especially sub-Saharan Africa, which is really behind on most of these goals. For instance, if you look at the number of people in extreme poverty, right? The bulk of those people are in sub-Saharan Africa and areas which what the UN calls areas facing conflict. Now, these conflicted areas are mainly because of wars. We talked about some of these wars. We talked about Sudan, for instance. This episode, we'll be talking about Palestine. We talked about Syria in the past. We talked about the kind of pressure applied on Venezuela, which has forced mass, refugee crisis over there. So many of these crises are, that we're talking about, which these UN reports never really chronicle, are caused by the intervention of the United States and its allies. So when we're talking, for instance, about global hunger, the fact that I think about 800 million people are in extreme poverty. Why are these people in extreme poverty? It's not just because of lack of funds, it's also because of capitalism and imperialism, and those factors are really never at the center of these kind of conversations, right? It's just about how we need more aid, how we need better delivery mechanisms, how governments have to show more political will. But what really is the reason for these crises is not mentioned. The fact that, for instance, the United States and its allies spend 75% of global military spending is never really factored in these reports. It's just mentioned. At the most, they critique the US for not spending enough on international aid or for cutting aid programs. But the structural aspects of our economy that actually prevent these goals from being achieved are not really reflected by these UN reports. And that's perhaps one of the sad aspects of it. I mean, it's one thing to say that, 120 million people have been forced from their homes. But the question is, why have they been forced? Like I said, what are the wars and conflicts that have caused it? It's one thing to say, for instance, that $1.4 trillion is being spent in debt servicing, but who owns these debts, right? It's largely the international institutions, private players like BlackRock, for instance, and there have been so many demands for a debt jubilee, so to speak, but really nothing has happened on that. What leads to inequality? What leads to the crisis of food when there is more than enough food being produced for everyone? All of these questions are never really answered, and I think that is where it's so essential that the answers of people's movements, that the answers of the left, that the radical solutions posed by people's organizations need to be pushed time and again, and that that we need to keep fighting that battle to push these slogans time and again, because the discussion of these sustainable goals only shows us where we are lagging, but not really why we are lagging and how we can solve it. And those two are really the important questions. And I think that's why it's sometimes essential to go back, because I think it puts these challenges front and center of us.
Definitely an important point, Prasanth. We know that the UN cannot do all that it should be doing, but we shouldn't dismiss its conclusions, its reports, because it is actually really informative about the situation in the world today. And again, it's tragic that we're 4 years away from 2030, and a lot of those goals seem unreachable. But in that regard, I mentioned before that some of these Latin American presidents, Petro, Lula, have made very important statements condemning the genocide in Gaza from day one. And Petro specifically has been extremely verbose on his Twitter in international spaces about this condemnation. And he's taken that a step further. He called last week for a conference regarding the genocide in Gaza of the Hague Group. So Roger, tell us about this conference. What's happening there?
Well, I think President Petro has shown real leadership around this. He is hosting, I think it's now the second day as we speak, second and final day of the conference, so in Bogota. So more than 30 nations have gathered. I think one of the most important things about this gathering is that it's not your usual kind of conference where people just kind of get together and have a little photo op or whatever. They're talking about serious stuff, about what they can do to bring pressure on the Israelis and their sponsors, the United States, to bring an end to this massacre that's taking place. All journalists watching this will, see through the news wires every day the kind of carnage that's coming through, but very little in terms of what can be done to stop all of this stuff from happening from time to time. We hear about moves taking place to progress ceasefire talks, but nothing ever seems to come, mainly because it's quite clear the Israelis have no real interest in bringing a conclusion, bringing any kind of ceasefire. And if there was a ceasefire, there's no confidence that they'd stick to it anyway, as history has shown. But this conference has brought together, I think importantly, more than 30 countries, mainly of the global south. So it's a global south statement saying something must change. This slaughter that we're seeing every single day must stop. And if necessary, we need to create more of a legal base to be able to do that. And that for me is one of the important things. But of course, it's not just the global south, it's big nations. So like China, I think Spain's there, Northern Ireland, not Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, that are there, that are all making their voices heard about the need to do something. So one of the key people at the conference is Francesca Albanese, the special rapporteur for the UN. And of course, she was, the US said that they announced last week that they're bringing sanctions against Miss Albanese, and I think that says everything about the US. Basically, it's saying that they don't want to hear the truth. They don't want anybody to expose what the Israelis are doing, and importantly, all the countries that are complicit in the slaughter that's taking place in Gaza, and of course expanded to now more so the West Bank, where settlers are, just with impunity now, just attacking Palestinians and displacing so many Palestinians now that it really is a part of the same conflict as what's taking place in Gaza. So during her contribution to the conference, Albanese was saying that we really need to have sanctions brought against brought against Israel now, and that those sanctions really need to mean something, and we can learn lessons from what happened during the fight against apartheid. And I think that's a really important point to make. So we'll see in the next few hours what the communique from that conference is. They called it an emergency conference because it is an emergency that's taking place. And I think the fact that the global south is coming together to raise our voices and saying it is time to bring an end to this conflict, I think is long overdue. But I think the Hague Group is a massively important initiative. It was set up in January, and I think we've not heard the last of this, because even when there is a halt to the fighting in Gaza, as at some point there will be, then there is still a need to give justice to the Palestinians, and I think the Hague Group will help to do that.
I think it's such an important point, Roger. And notably also, this conference is taking place as actions across countries in Europe are being organized by trade unionists, by dock workers, by activists to actually block military cargo from going to Israel. Of course, this isn't, blocking 100% of the cargo, but I think it's, in tandem with these efforts on the international diplomatic level are crucial, because, again, unfortunately, the countries that really hold the levers in this situation are the United States, are the European countries where this military cargo is passing through. So the more that there's people pressure, the more that there's diplomatic pressure, that is actually what is needed to really bring an end to this genocide. And you mentioned, Roger, that Israel's violence is not only happening in Gaza, but is actually expanding across the region. And as we speak, Israel is bombing Syria, it is bombing Dara, it is bombing Damascus. And this is a very dangerous escalation. We know that in December, the government of Bashar al-Assad fell when HTS militants essentially were able to take over key parts of the country. He fled to Russia. And right after that, a lot of people thought, okay, this person seems open to Israel, this person seems open to the United States. Perhaps Syria won't be a place that is continually attacked, as it had been for the last decade. But right after Ahmed al-Shara, Jolani took over, essentially Israel began to bomb key military sites in Syria. It really began to put pressure on. It occupied parts of the Golan Heights. And this is all at the same time that Ahmed al-Shara is saying that he's actually open to some sort of, maybe it's not normalization, but maybe it's, some sort of agreement with Israel. And so I think it's really important to highlight that the images you're seeing right now, again, bombing of Syria's major cities, again, key infrastructure is happening while the government is, in some way extending an olive branch to a country that's been, genocidally attacking the entire region. And it goes to show that really being a friend of Israel, as long as you're a country in the region, really means nothing, because Israel's ultimate plan is not to have peace with the region, but is to control it. And so, of course, I'm not going to go into kind of the backstory of these bombings. I think it's really important to understand the sectarian violence that's been taking place, but there's no justification for a different country to be bombing another country with no, of course, it's a completely illegal, completely against international law. So it's really concerning. And I think it's really exemplifying that just because you're a friend of the United States, allegedly. Just because you're trying to be a friend of Israel does not protect you from these, irrational and illegal attacks. So really concerning situation. We're going to keep covering it. I know we're coming out with a piece pretty soon. Follow journalists from the region to understand this. It's really important because, as you said, Roger, this is kind of, we're in the thick of it. And it's not, we're going to see how it plays out, but it's really crucial to follow. So with that being said, an unfortunate point to end on, but I think really, really important for people to be engaged in this. Keep following People's Dispatch. As I said, we're going to be coming out with reports and analysis regarding this. Follow Morning Star. We're the people that are actually going to be bringing you an analysis of what's happening. That's not just from a US or Israeli lens. It's crucial to understand kind of all sides of this. So thank you for joining us. Unfortunately, ending on a bad note, but of course, let's pay attention to the Hague Group. Let's pay attention to the trade unionists blocking military cargo, because these are the actions that are going to give us the hope to be able to continue fighting another day.